better than mine. Yeah. Well, it's now 10:30, and it's time for Brainstorming the Human Connection, brought to you by the South Dakota Humanities Council. My name is Lawrence Diggs. I will be the host and inquisitor for this program today. And we're going to be talking about the environment today. But before we do, we're going to be talking to Jennifer Whitman, who is the book festival leader and coordinator and cook with all the firewood, all of that. Um, because we're going to be talking about the environment, and one of the person that's going to be our guest today is actually going to be speaking at that um, uh, the book festival, and so you'll have a chance to actually get a firsthand interaction with him and to have some interesting discussions about the environment. The book that we're going to be talking about is actually a fictional book, but it has to do with real issues. And those real issues are what we're going to be talking about today. So let's start with Jennifer. Jennifer, tell us a little bit about what's happening with the book festival and what kind of exciting events are we going to be expecting?
All right, well, I will happily do that, Lawrence. Thank you for giving me a couple of minutes. Thrilled to have Don Carr today. He's kind of kicking off a series where some of our brainstorming guests, not all of them in a row, but several of them will be authors who are coming to the 2024 South Dakota Festival of Books. And the dates, please mark your calendar if you haven't already. That is September 20th through the 22nd, and it is in Brookings. Those of you who have been to festivals in Brookings before, especially if you were there in 2022, a lot of the venues and things will be familiar to you. We will be headquartering and having our exhibitors hall at the Oscar Larson Performing Arts Center, where we will have a lot of our speaking events going on. But of course, we always want to show off the cultural centers and venues throughout Brookings. We'll have the Children's Museum of South Dakota, we'll use the public library, we'll use the Brookings Arts Council, some of our great museums, McCrory Gardens, things like that. So September 20th through the 22nd, we've got a lot of great authors coming in a lot of different genres, as we always try to do. I will point out that one that people are really excited about right now is that Billy Mills is coming, and I happen to know from following his social media that he is still in Paris at the Olympics enjoying the 60th anniversary of his come from behind win in the 10,000 meters in Tokyo back in 1964. But we try to have as much as we can for history and poetry and fiction and children's. And among those, one of them we were just chatting about is the novelist Peter Heller, who is absolutely wonderful, writes these great outdoor adventure stories. We're thrilled to have just added Ned Blackhawk to the lineup. He won the National Book Award last year for The Rediscovery of America, which looks at Native cultures and their influence on our history, and how really maybe when we look at history, we're not looking at it quite the right way. We've got some, as I said, wonderful poets, wonderful children's authors, in addition to Billy Mills, who has a children's book. We have many people with South Dakota connections, which is a category into which Don falls, having been a South Dakota native. And we try to, as you know, do as broad a spectrum of topics as we can. There'll be people talking about issues of race and issues of identity and issues of heritage and issues of land ownership. And one of the things that Don will talk about, which is issues of the environment, of how we approach taking care of the land, conservation, pollution, all of those things. So I'm really excited about it. And one of the fun things about Don is that he is writing about it in a novel. He's made it a thriller. He's written fiction, but he has the thread of truth through all of it from all of his experience as a journalist covering these things and working with environmental groups. So it's a really fun book, The Midnight Rambler. It's very propulsive. All takes place in Italy, and you'll learn a few things along the way. Who knew? Who knew how much firepower some of these environmental agents might have? So I'll let him tell you more about that. But Brookings, September 20th through the 22nd. Please join us. Almost everything is free and very few things require any registration. Show up and just find the authors you want to listen to.
Yeah. Thank you a whole bunch. Hope everybody will have jotted down all of those dates and times. And is a website for that up now? Can people start following that?
Yep, if you go to sdbookfestival.com, we have our full roster up on the website. So we have all our sponsors up. One thing that I know everybody is eagerly awaiting, and it is on my desk in the form of multiple messy spreadsheets, is the ultimate event schedule. We hope to have that online in a couple of weeks so you can start actually planning where you're going to be when. But you can definitely go and see our whole lineup on the website right now, sdbookfestival.com.
Okay, great. Well, we'll get down now to our subject at hand, and I'm going to let Don uh, talk a little bit about his background. He used to be the senior communications policy advisor for the Environmental Working Group, and maybe can talk a little bit about that. And he was also the senior communications manager at the Environmental Defense Fund. Are you still doing that, Don? Okay,
No,
that's right.
currently I am the media director for the Alliance of the Great Lakes is my new environmental gig.
It's okay, good, great. So uh, let's talk about a little bit about your background so that those who are with us can have an idea of who is this Don Carr guy anyway.
Sure. I always grew up writing, and I wrote for the Sioux Falls Lincoln paper, or the high school paper at Lincoln High School. I'm trying to remember, it's called the Patriot. Is it called the Patriot? I'm not. Maybe it's the Statesman. And then, of course, I went to USD and wrote for the Volant. And I'd always written my whole life, but I never kind of thought this would ever happen. Like I, grew up reading fiction, reading novels, Tom Clancy novels, Robert Ludlum novels, loving all that stuff, and didn't really have a direction for writing that way, and studied to be a journalist. And one of the things I learned when I studied to be a journalist was you had to be objective. I'm not a very objective person. I bring opinion to everything that I do, and especially with things that I feel emotional about, like the environment, I bring opinion to it. So that's how I kind of found my way into environmental work and environmental groups. I ended up working in politics for a while in South Dakota, and I got recruited to work on the Farm Bill by the Environmental Working Group because agriculture has a big impact on the environment. And what they told me, I didn't really have a lot of experience in environmental work at the time, was because of where you're from, that's more important than what you know. So they taught me more about what I needed to know in the job but because of who I was and where I came from, and I came from a farming family, that had more of an impact than anything. And then working for these groups, I started up doing journalism on accident in between gigs and really liked it, and doing investigative work became something I really enjoyed and felt compelled to do. And, you and I talked earlier, Lawrence, about this, radicalize is maybe the wrong word, but it kind of says the right term. I really did get involved in the environment and did get radicalized by what I experienced, by people getting, their communities polluted, not having a voice against big corporations that were doing all this pollution. And it really kind of informed the rest of my life and the work I wanted to do. Specifically for the book, and here I'll give a little, there we go.
Sure.
Specifically for the book, how that ended up coming around was I had been doing another book project, a nonfiction project. And I had a book agent at the time who had brought me a whistleblower on a biofuel fraud case. And so for 18 months, I worked on this book proposal, this nonfiction book proposal, and interviewed dozens of EPA special agents. And I had never, all the environmental work I'd done over the years, I'd never realized the EPA had federal agents that guns and badges could kick down doors and arrest criminal polluters. And I thought, that's really cool. I mean, that's a really neat job. And these people are incredibly dedicated. I mean, they're professionals like any other, federal agent would be, very dedicated for the job, very dedicated to, putting people behind bars that are hurting our planet. So then Fast forward, we're in Italy. My wife had a sabbatical there, and we're traveling through Italy, and we're driving by Mount Vesuvius, and there's smoke coming off the mountain. And so I asked the driver, as anyone would driving by a volcano with smoke coming off it, was like, "Hey, is this active?" And he said, "No, that's the Camorra Mafia. And what they've been doing for 30 years is purchasing toxic waste from the EU has much stronger chemical laws than we do in America. And so a lot of companies in the EU, instead of paying fines or figuring expensive ways to dispose of their chemicals, they let the Camorra take them, dump them on Mount Vesuvius, and set them on fire." And so I kind of had this, oh wow, this aha moment, like that's a real thing that's happening, but it's also happening in this location. It's very like Bond movie-esque. You sit on these cliffs, you look at these bays, and these huge yachts are there, and you're thinking like, when are one of those going to explode, like in a Bond movie? So it kind of lends itself to this very action-oriented atmosphere. And then the book is called The Midnight Rambler. What I'm having, I'm reading this book there called the 25 or the 40 songs that make the Rolling Stones. Chapter 24 is the song The Midnight Rambler by the Rolling Stones. It was written in Positano, where I was sitting at that very moment. And the song is about the Boston Strangler. So there I had my antagonist. So that's kind of how it all came together.
So, wow, interesting. Now you have some political connection too. I mean, you have been had your fingers in politics, or at least been around those people who have been discussing these issues. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that experience informs how you approach the subject?
Absolutely. Yeah, I had no real like direction of what I was going to do with my life for a while, and was bouncing around South Dakota, bounced around out west. And the Thune Daschle campaign happened in 2004, and I just because my wife was a political science major and was working on campaigns, I just kind of followed her into the job and was worked on that campaign as the staffer on the Daschle side, and found I had kind of a knack for it, for the communications part of it, writing press releases, talking to reporters, having that kind of engagement with folks. And right around that time, the DNC was run by Howard Dean, and he engaged what was called the 50-state strategy. And this is where they're paying staffers in every state. And South Dakota staffers were some of the first hires. And so my wife and I were the first hires kind of for the DNC program in South Dakota. So I spent 2 years kind of being, a flack. I chit-chatted to reporters and blasted out press releases and did all that good stuff. And I loved it. I mean, for me, work has to be something I'm emotionally invested in. And I believe in those issues. And I believe in South Dakota wanting to make it a better place, environmental wise, humanity wise, all that stuff. So it really was a great job, and it was transformative for me. And then it set me up to work in the environmental movement and kind of do the same job, which I've been doing for the past 15 years now.
Okay. So when we talk about fiction, which is, the Midnight Rambler is a fictional book. As Jennifer indicated before, a lot of this is based on actual real life events, and your book is based in Italy, but we're in South Dakota. Talk to us about the connection between what's happening in your book and what we live here in South Dakota. Make it relevant for us.
Well, I'll start off by saying, part of the reason I went fiction, not just because I wanted to always write a novel and I've written several before, and this was the first one that someone felt had the quality level to put actually out in the world. And that just kind of been a dream of mine. But I actually done some work with Hollywood and writing about how Hollywood recently has taken on environmental narratives, and how Hollywood and TV and film, because our lives are so driven by narrative and story, and because I'd worked in environmental movement for so long, and one white paper after another comes out. This chemical's bad. This product's bad. This thing's bad. People kind of just tune out. You kind of glaze over after a while when you get this deluge of bad news and all the scientific data is thrown at you. And so what people started realizing was narratives and storytelling, those are the things that really internalize. Those are things that we really take close and we really use to make decisions in our lives. And so storytelling became very prominent in the environmental space, and people are making a more of a move to include climate change in narratives, or how environmentalists are portrayed. I wrote a couple stories about that. So that's when I kind of got locked into the idea that and I should say this, I wanted to write as an entertaining as possible novel. That was my goal one. I did not want to write something that was, a huge message book. So the whole idea here is something that's very entertaining, over the top action, and just like a little tiny side dish of broccoli, just a little bit there. That was my goal with this. But there is, because I believe so much in the environmental movement and what needs to happen, there is a little bit of message in that. Now, to tie it to South Dakota, the theme of this is basically, and it happens across the world, happens nationally, and it trickles all the way down to South Dakota, is that the communities that are usually affected by pollution or that are affected by negative environmental outcomes are always the communities that they're the frontline communities, they're fence line communities, they're communities that constantly don't have a voice. And so what I wanted to kind of show with my protagonist here was she was a straight up hero. She's not conflicted at all about her mission. It is protecting people that can't protect themselves from environmental pollution. So in South Dakota, for example, I can remember two instances. One, it's funny when you think about back what formed you and made you what you were, but I was a high school debater. And my senior year in high school, the national debate topic was water quality. And this was 1988. I won't tell, that basically dates how old I am, but and so my partner and I, we actually did our debate brief on Homestead Gold Mine and ways to remediate the water that's getting polluted from the Homestead Gold Mine at the time. Another thing that informed this in South Dakota was the Big Sioux River. I grew up in Sioux Falls, and for a lot of years, I was a camp counselor at Leif Erikson Day Camp, which is along the river. And we would take kids traipsing up and through that river all day long. And you'd notice clumps of things floating down, but you really wouldn't think about it. And a counselor or a kid might not show up to camp the next day. And we would just say, that's creek flu. That's what we would just say, it's creek flu. Now, I later on, I would go working on in the environmental movement and agriculture specifically, and livestock agriculture, and learn that above the Big Sioux River, the sloping bluffs up there, those were built specifically for cattle operations. So the manure would slope down in the river. And so we're literally traipsing kids through this manure-laden river every day with no knowledge of it. So the stuff's around all the time. And the Big Sioux still needs to be cleaned up. It's still a travesty that it goes through one of the most beautiful cities in the country, and it's just polluted still.
Mm. We're going to come back to that because I think that that's an important thing to kind of get under the covers of. But let's take a little, let's say, a 50,000 foot view for a moment and look at what are the major environmental, let's say, crimes that we can find now. Because some of these things we worked hard, or at least some people did work hard to get laws and science and all of that done. But it's almost like nobody's paying attention to it. So tell us a little bit about what are the major things that we actually have laws against, but people are still just sort of like ignoring the laws or flaunting them or skirting them.
For sure. And there's a difference in America with other countries too, how we approach it with laws. I'll give a couple examples nationally and then some examples for South Dakota. When I worked for the Environmental Defense Fund, one of the things I learned, which just blew my mind, was there's a thing called a take. So when you're in the Permian Basin, which is in Texas and is a big oil-rich part of the country, and there's a lot of oil production happening there, there's the lesser prairie chicken and there's the sage grouse. These are birds that live down there some of them are endangered. So these companies are allowed a take, which means that's the amount of birds they're allowed to kill every year. That's just written in the law. And that was kind of astounding to me. More specifically with South Dakota, I think non-point source pollution is the thing that we're contending with now. So under the Clean Water Act, if you have a pipe that's coming from your factory and spewing out toxic waste, we're going to find you. We're going to fine you. If you don't keep doing it, we're going to put guys that run your company in jail. That's perfectly acceptable and it's a great way the Clean Water Act works. There's a provision called the non-point source exemption. And what that means is things like farm fields or other places where things trickle off different ways, that can't be regulated. And that's why Lake Mitchell every year turns, house paint green. Wall Lake the same, Lake Alvin. You have these algal blooms that happen because this non-point source runoff happens, and it is not regulated at all under law.
Hmm. So, but I'm looking for the things that are, because the things that aren't, we need to work on those. But the things that are, because your book is about, people who are actually just breaking the laws there, but people are breaking the law and somebody's going to go find them. Can we find those kind of things here in the U.S. and particularly South Dakota, where we actually have laws, but if we look close, people are avoiding the laws, or are we just we need some new laws, or how does that? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I see what you're asking. The hard part for this part is like those things aren't very sexy. Like, with the things that Environmental Protection Agency would regularly be like catalytic converter theft, or a lot of times folks like with diesel engines, they'll take the governors off. That's a thing that actually EPA special agents would go companies illegally taking governors off diesel engines for transpo so that the emissions are higher. I mean, that it gets very technical and very sciencey, but those are the things actually that are happening right now in South Dakota, that those laws are getting broken. Poaching laws for wildlife, for example, that might be U.S. Fish and Wildlife, but also EPA special agents kind of cross jurisdiction that as well. So yes, but it's not as fantastical as a mafia cartel dumping chemicals on a volcano and setting it on fire. Maybe if because it's fiction, taking some liberties to make it readable, exciting.
Right. Yeah, yeah. Well, I was just, even though it's not in your book, I was just wondering if you're aware of any of those, um, let's say, issues where, things that we can say, okay, look, we made this law, and before we make some new laws, or at least while we're making new laws, how about we maybe enforce the ones that we have? Or maybe there aren't any. I don't want to just make a problem, but if there is, I want to talk about
Yeah, Lawrence, I think you're zeroing in there. I mean, I'll have to come back to the Clean Water Act and the non-point source exemption. That is a law, a bedrock
it.
federal law that works pretty good, but there's a part of it that's a loophole that allows massive livestock operations to pollute our waterways. So that is directly, and that happens in South Dakota. So I think that's exactly what you're talking about there. Other than that, I mean, some people would say we have too many laws, too many confusing laws. I will say this when you ask this question, the thing I want to get to the 50,000 foot level is what's happening actually above that level is climate change is probably the du jour issue we should be talking about, especially for South Dakota. And maybe to kind of turn what you're asking me a little bit like, for example, Sioux Falls, the city of Sioux Falls did not accept federal money to help with climate change, but the state is going to see more powerful rainstorms that dump more water from the atmosphere. And it's going to make it harder for wastewater and infrastructure in cities in South Dakota to be resilient in the face of these events. The grasslands, the Black Hills National Forest, they're going to get drier. We're going to have more fires and more wildfires and more fire events that people are going to have to contend with. And as you and I were talking earlier, that's a quality of life issue. If you're sitting around fearful of a wildfire, or you're in danger of being, your property being consumed by wildfire, that is not a pursuit of happiness. You're not in a good place as a person with that fear. And again, this is another side issue, but eco anxiety again is very real too. People are very worried about the direction things are going and what the future generations are going to hold. So, I mean, I mean, you might be asking the wrong guy. Do we need to pass more environmental laws? Yes, we need to pass a jillion more. Like I am going to be for protecting every drop of water, no matter what happens. But that's just my point of view. Other people might think we have to have a business. The climate has to operate. People have to have jobs. These things happen. Everything has an impact. No matter what we do, it has an impact. And you and I were talking earlier about, eating bacon cheeseburgers. It's awesome. They're delicious. They're cheap. They're plentiful. But what's the back end? What's the part of your life that's being affected that you don't see from having a cheap bacon cheeseburger?
Okay, we'll get back to that, but I want to open it up now to our esteemed panel, such as they are, to have some weigh in. Do you have questions that you would like to pose? Do you have an environmental story? This is a discussion. That's what this program is about. So just kind of raise your hand or turn on your mic, and don't all speak at once. Okay, Lanico, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Two things. First of all, I can barely hear you, Lawrence.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, but you fade out. Exactly what's going on there. But
okay.
Yeah, my comment is just recently I heard Supreme Court Judge Gorgeous, I'm butchering his name. Anyway, he was talking about there are too many laws. we just have so many laws, and half the people who are supposed to be obeying them don't even know they exist. So the second comment that the comment I wanted to make here was, I'm waiting for a thriller to come out called The Enforcer, about these laws that are definitely connected to, yes, is that an enforcer book? That's what I haven't read that yet. But my thoughts on the matter was that, in some places they form these squads or teams, and these teams go out and they do some kind of investigation on a local level, and they correct things that are supposed to be going on. And the book I'm thinking about is really, really old. I can't even remember the title of it, but I thought we need a book like that for this period of our lives. And the enforcers would be local people who are following up on these laws that are pertinent to their environmental condition where they are, and the violations that are being opposing, or they're causing problems, let's put it that way, for the people who are living in these specific areas. When I was thinking about that, this kind of happened as a result of the Home State gold mine shutting down. Remember all the arsenic tailings that were in the Cheyenne River, and how the people were having all kinds of problems and getting sick, and little children were in the water, swimming, doing things of this nature, and coming back with these skin issues, all because of those tailings. And it was a local group on Cheyenne River who went after that, and it just so happened things kind of like a domino effect. It ended up that the gold mines were shut down. And it wasn't because of I don't think it was because of the arsenic runoff. I think it was because they were running out of gold. But who's written a story on that? I don't think anybody has. But
Well,
that's what
Anika, go ahead, I'm
enforcer.
sorry. I'll say real quick, you brought up Cheyenne River and folks on the ground and what happened there. And that's an important part of this that Lawrence and I were talking about was, laws can only go so far. People make choices what to enforce. People make choices about who to prosecute. But really, it's the voice of folks on the ground who are being impacted that needs to be raised up. And that's why all this is kind of a crisis that is interconnected with the kind of the cratering in the news media, how less journalism we have excuse me, reporting on these issues. I do really appreciate South Dakota Searchlight. I think that organization is doing fantastic work on environmental issues in South Dakota, but those stories need to be told and they need to be amplified. And that's the only way policymakers, lawmakers, and government officials will pay attention and then take action. But I'll say this, for the enforcers, that's exactly what's going on here. She is an EPA enforcer and she's kicking polluters' butts.
And I think, Lanico, you bring up a really important point about citizen involvement. And yes, having a book to inspire some people, that's a good thing, and then sometimes a necessary thing to create a narrative where people can see themselves in a role. I mean, intellectually, I'm just thinking, okay, well, you live this thing, why don't you just do it? But reality is that sometimes people have to have a context in which to see, to even just to think about, well, what would I do? They know they want to do something. And to respond to, complaints like a Gorchitz, like, oh, there's too many laws. Well, actually, that's what people have been saying all along. And I remember a time when I used to work between San Francisco and LA. And I would fly down to LA and I had to take two white shirts because between the time that I left the airport and I got to the office, my shirt was grungy because of the pollution in the air. You could see if I drove, when you came over the San Bernardino Mountains, you could see LA because there was a thick, almost like coffee like atmosphere setting on LA. I mean, that's how bad the air was. You don't see that now, right? So to me, okay, uh, too many laws. You and me, we actually want to go back to that. You know, we have a time in America where people would turn on their water faucets and fire would come out because there was gas in the line and it exploded. That was the water. I mean, that's a thing. You can find it in history. It's not a narrative that someone made up. This is a thing that people live, and that's what turned Republicans into environmentalists. Nixon was the person who put up the EPA because people were suffering, but people got off their couch and said, "Hey, you know, enough is enough. You're moving us out of our neighborhood into another place where it's going to be that bad in 10 years, you know, and I don't want this for my kids." That's all to say that this is not just sort of cocktail talk. These are real live issues that people have to grapple with.
Lawrence,
So let's
real quick,
talk. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I just want to jump on your point real quick, and you're absolutely 100% right. We had these environmental problems. We passed laws and enforced them and solved them, from smog to the ozone hole to the Chaga River going on fire. Lake Erie was completely polluted with industrial pollutants and was cleaned up. Is now polluted again, and I don't want to go back to the ag runoff thing, but that's what's polluting it again. We don't have a law protecting it for that, so Lake Erie is once again polluted, and we need to figure out laws to stop that. And so we have the ability. We do.
Yeah, and I should add that we really shouldn't have to have laws. If people were morally responsible, we don't need the laws. I mean, we shouldn't need a law to tell someone don't dump stuff in people's water that you wouldn't want your kids to drink. You know,
Yep.
why are you putting it over there? If it's okay for these people's kids to drink, why do you think it's not okay for your kids to drink? You know, why should they? So you can make money. Their kids have to have an antenna growing out of their head because of something you put in the water. You know, it's, I mean, why do you need a law to tell people that? You know, even if you didn't go to church to learn to do everything, you know, with your neighbors or be, you know, kind to your neighbors, just a moral human connection should do that. But apparently, we need the laws because people apparently are not doing that. You know,
Couldn't agree more.
Stacey, you're trying to say something, or you have your hand up?
Yeah, Trish has a good comment in the chat, but she has a question too, and she says, "Don, I understand that you intend to turn this into a 3-book series. Will the other 2 books following the same storyline in Italy, or will you be bringing in other related global issues?"
Well, I want to say thanks to my fellow coyote for the question. And yes, it is a 3-book series. No, it won't be set in Italy. I don't want to give too much away, but the second book starts on Lake Superior. The middle part of it is in South Dakota, and it ends in Las Vegas. That's all I'm going to say.
That's a roller coaster already. You know?
Got to try and top the first one, Lawrence. I mean,
Yeah, there you go.
pressure's
That's
on.
right. That's right. You got to keep the momentum going here.
Right.
Is there anyone else who has something that they want to add to this conversation before we start to monopolize it again?
Can I
Going
hop
once?
in with a quick,
Yeah,
just a quick
yeah,
question?
sure.
Don, I think you've done some reporting up in North Dakota in the oil fields and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think for a lot of us that we know that that's very close to where we are. We know that it's had huge environmental effects, which also had huge cultural effects and other kinds of things going on there. What were your experiences with what's going on in North Dakota?
Yeah, the Bakken. So I think Lawrence and I talked about this earlier too. South Dakota is unique in that, it doesn't have a lot of oil, gas, or mineral resources. I mean, gold in the Black Hills was the one kind of thing there. And, Wyoming and North Dakota experienced massive growth because of their oil and gas reserves. And hydraulic fracturing was the technique that was developed. And this is, God, it's going on 15 years ago when I got to go deep in the memory bank for this one. Is one of my first investigations I did with EWG was when the fracking boom was happening in North Dakota. But the technique of hydraulic fracturing, where you inject high pressure water and chemicals deep in the shale rock to let the gas come out, that was kind of the whole investigation was, what is that byproduct? They use cleaning byproducts with it. They use a lot of different chemicals in it. What's the impacts of that on water was our investigations. And we found it was terrible. Again, folks could set their drinking water on fire, Lawrence, with
Yeah.
the natural gas fracking. But again, I want to make this clear too, when I talk about agriculture and fracking, we all have to eat, right? We all have to eat. And so, agriculture is demonized in a lot of these conversations about the pollution, and rightly so, but everything has an impact. And we have to kind of realize and write our laws around that. Natural gas fracking and what's happened in the Bakken was bad for the environment and bad for climate change in a lot of ways, but it also helped in emissions in a lot of ways. Natural gas was a little cleaner than what we were doing with coal and everything else. So I always want to kind of try, there's no middle ground. There was a lot of badness going up there, but it helped us gain a little energy independence in the world. It did a lot of other things at the time that we needed to have happen in our country. But the end result was now we're facing a hotter planet. And that's, I think, where I would land on what happened up there was, I don't think we realized when we were working on those investigations all along, we were very focused on what was happening on that particular part of the ground and what the water quality was happening, when the broader issue we really should have been concerned with was, how do we turn this tap off now? How much, because we're flaring natural gas, we're letting methane escape from these operations, and we didn't think through enough because we're Americans and we just like to keep go. And that's just part of our nature. So yeah, it was really eye-opening for me to do that. And if anyone wants to see the movie Gasland, I think it was documented as up for an Academy Award. That is more on Pennsylvania and Colorado than North Dakota, but the same issues are in that documentary.
These bring up some important issues too, about how we go about improving our environmental situation, because often we think do it or not do it, but sometimes it's like rethinking how we do it. A lot of times we can find the technology to do it, but you have to have let's say, the catalyst, and you have to have the motivation to look for other solutions, because human beings tend to want to do tomorrow what they did yesterday because they're comfortable with it. And if, it's hard to get past the inertia of like, yeah, we're doing it that way, but we could do it 10% better, or even 1% better. It's not the whole thing, but it's something. And all of us have a stake in it. So like, we can put the emphasis on, well, let's find a better way. And then we say, okay, now we found this better way, that's what we're going to do. That's where the law comes in. But I think, it's not just like pointing at people and say, okay, you go fix the problem, unless they caused the problem. It's like, if there was no problem before, you come up with a new invention, but the invention makes life bad for the rest of us. Well, you kind of have an obligation, if we're going to buy that product, and that's going to be in the market. To me, it seems fair that you should make it so that there's no impact on the rest of us, especially if we don't need or don't buy your product. It's kind of like you have people in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and their whole country is being flooded because the rest of the world wants to have cars. Somehow that doesn't seem fair.
No.
I mean, we could say, okay, well, it's all right to have a car. Yeah, but if you flood everybody else's, other people's whole country, so that their country doesn't exist anymore, kind of seems like you owe them something. I mean, if somebody could make a case against that, I'm all open to listening. But it just seems to me that seems like a fair thing.
Well, and you're right. And right now there's a huge movement, climate lawsuits against oil companies. Montana, some kids just went all the way to the state Supreme Court in Montana and won their case there about climate change affecting their future. And I did some work in New Mexico with the Environmental Crime Unit in Mexico, interviewed the guy who leads the Environmental Crime Unit there. And there's abandoned wells all over New Mexico that are just venting methane into the atmosphere that no one's responsible for. And the oil company's been really good, really good about telling us it's our fault, that we should focus on our carbon footprint and what we're doing and what we're polluting, when they should be the ones who've known since 1972 that their product was going to cause global climate change.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think one of the I don't know how you don't exactly. I wouldn't call them heroes, but certainly one of the people, one of the industries that's going to make an impact is the insurance industry,
Oh yeah.
because they will start to end up, But in order to do that, you're going to have laws, and you're going to have research to show that, hey, this is a causal thing. And if the insurance company is saying, well, we're not going to pay for that, if there's some money that has now you say, okay, if you can't operate without insurance, you have to come up with the money. If it's not insurable, at least they seem to be able to shut down other things that people want to do with insurance. It seems like something like this should work too.
No, you're right. And this
Uh,
stuff is solvable. I mean, I-29, I-90, I'm old enough to remember when they were choke full of trash, when people just threw
Yep.
everything out their windows driving. And
Yep.
we changed that. We cleaned up the roadways, and it was a national initiative that did that.
Exactly. And not to mention forest fires. People used to throw their cigarettes butts out the window. You know what I mean? It's like you got an ashtray right there in your car, but you just throw a lit cigarette out the window. Well, after that causes a few fires, people say, well, maybe we don't want people doing that, you know. And you should be able to just tell people, hey, that's kind of like not a thing anymore. You got this ashtray, and you might want your lungs to be an ashtray, but the rest of us don't want the whole country to be an ashtray because you throw your your cigarette out the window. Maybe you ought to do something about that. That should just be a thing. It's not. So now we have laws that say, hey, we catch you, and then you pay.
Off to the Huska.
Yeah, yeah. What kind of things then should we be focusing on now? I mean, we're making a turn. I hope we keep the turn. What's on the horizon for things that we should be working on, and what kinds of things should we be doing? I mean, laws are one thing. I think we have an agreement on that. What are the other kind of things that we can do that we don't have to get let's say a law passed or a constitutional amendment or something? What can and should we be doing to make some impact on making the environment we live in better?
Well, we talked a little bit about this earlier, which is getting the word out. Awareness is a thing that in the environmental movement we talk about all the time. Raising awareness is a term we use. Why we're going to the news media with X problem. Aside from laws and that, there's really not else more we can do in terms of your local level cleaning up. And I kind of already touched on, doing your own personal stuff and recycling, which is great. That's industry kind of pulling your strings a little bit and making you feel like you're doing something better when they could be doing much more at scale at the top of the ladder. Truth be told, a lot of the environmental laws we have, and I should have said this at the top when we were talking about it, was enforcement is a big part of this. You can pass a law, but if the cop isn't on the ground walking the beat and arresting the perp, the law doesn't matter. And a lot of that happens in the environmental space and with the EPA. I mean, there's a lot of jurisdictions where they're asked to come in and take over that they don't want to because the politics on the ground, and in South Dakota, as you know, the politics can get very stringent on the ground. A very independent-minded state. No farmer wants an EPA agent walking their land. I know my grandfather wouldn't have wanted that. So there's a disconnect there between enforcement and law. But personal choices can, and I want to say, totally let's say personal choices don't matter. And plastics, I think, is the place where we can make the most decisions about personal choice and the environment. And it's all tied together. Plastics are derived again from petrochemicals. Since we've been decreasing the amount of fossil fuels we've been trying to consume, the fossil fuel companies have shifted into producing more plastics with their product, and they're permeating the environment. We talked about, I work with the Great Lakes a lot in my day work, and where I work, we just did a study where we have all these great. This is a great story. So I had no idea this was going on in this place. I took the job last November. They have an Adopt a Beach program. So on all the Great Lakes, we have these crews that go out in the spring and the fall, and they clean the beaches. They're volunteers, 10,000 of them. And they've been doing it for 20 years, all these beach cleanups. So we gave them smartphones with an app that cataloged what they picked up on the beach. And for this spring, we released for the first time 20 years of that data. Shockingly, 86% of it was plastic. And this plastic breaks down, it gets into smaller pieces and smaller pieces and smaller pieces, and then it eventually gets in the environment in our bodies. And we're now learning through, weirdly enough, hip replacements, because they're a majority of plastic, how plastics migrate through the bloodstream and end up in the brain. So that's a long, kind of complicated way to say that your personal choice with using plastics and buying single-use plastics needs to end.
So here's a case where, okay, their lifestyles are interchanged with plastics. And it seems like awareness is a thing, but it just seems a how-to is a thing too, and making it part of the flow. If somebody has to do something extra, it's not just the extra thing that's a problem. It's the defocusing from what you're trying to do. It's like if you have a rhythm, you get up this time in the morning and you're going to this thing, you always stop at this place to get that thing, a drink or something like that. There are all kinds of things you do that's a routine, and that routine allows you the headspace to make some other decisions. You kind of put things together. That's kind of how we operate. So if something is a stretch, if you have to break the routine, chances are it's not going to get done, because one, you won't remember it. It's going to be something you wake up in the middle of the night and say, I woulda, coulda, shoulda. It'll be a good thing. You feel good about it for that moment. But then when it comes down to actually doing it, you haven't found a way to work it into your routine yet. So can you talk a little bit about, some of the things that we might be able to do? Let's take plastics, for example, that could shift how we operate daily, so that we do it and we don't have to really make some kind of philosophical soliloquy to ourselves every day. We just do it.
I think mindfulness is probably what we're talking about here, and be mindful about how you're operating every day. And I think that has another silo to it too, the mindfulness discussion, which is, modern life is pretty awesome. I can pick up my phone right here, I can tap a button, and we talk about a bacon cheeseburger can arrive at my doorstep in 20 minutes, fully health. It's health. There's no health fear of like pathogens or things like that, because it's been sealed in plastic and it's sterilized, and I'm not going to get food poisoning from it. I'm going to enjoy it. I'm enjoying it from my big flat screen TV, and anything I want to watch is immediately available at push of a button. And that is amazing. Like, life is great that way. We're being satiated. Like, it's really helping us. We're not being mindful though. We're cramming our lives full of these events, one after the other. We're not taking the time, the breath it takes to just kind of enjoy life from a passive moment. And we live in a capitalist society, and for a lot of reasons, capitalism is amazing. It's delivered us, again, like all these cool whiz bang things, makes life really fun, go to concerts and movies. At the same time, they're in the business to make money, and they realize the more of our lives that we're not mindful, the more products they can cram in there. And so if you're being more mindful about your day, and believe me, I'm one to preach, I love all this stuff. But I think that's how, we get to a better place where you realize everything you do has an impact, but your impact is small compared to the impact of these massive corporations that are every year turning a profit, every year making more and more money. And every year, the people at the top of those companies that are insanely wealthy, they're bunkered up somewhere. They're not going to feel the effects of this stuff. It's the communities that don't have a voice, the communities that are poor, that have always been on the front lines, that endure the pollution from all these operations. So maybe think about, you said this earlier, and I thought it was brilliant. You got to think about your neighbor. What happened to being neighborly? What happened to the social compact where we do one thing for our neighbor, they do the thing for us? I think we need to get to that space.
Right. I'm going to go to Lanico, but I want to come back to that because I think that's a really important point. Lanico, you've had your hand up for a while. I think the blood's draining out now.
Yeah, yeah, I love these conversations. I just thought of a few things. We were talking about, and Lawrence, you're going to go back to plastics, and I was mindful of what's going on in Colorado regarding their law against use of plastic, and brought me to the thoughts on retraining ourselves. I have done something that I thought was, why didn't I think of this earlier? I now have in my trunk a big cooler and a small cooler. So when I go grocery shopping, I take my paper bag, or not my paper bags, but my cloth bags into the grocery store and fill them with my groceries. When I get out to the car, because it's hot out, I just throw that stuff into my coolers. And I have to drive quite a ways to get groceries where I live. But that was a point that I wanted to make. And the other thing I wanted to say was we need to have a movement of earth cleanup tourism. That tourism will teach us what's working out there, who's doing what that's really working, and they're having all kinds of success with that. And then the last thing I wanted to make a comment about, and I know we're running out of time, what is going to happen when the insurance companies, the insurance industry around the world collapses? Because we're seeing right now along the seashores, all these individuals are wanting to build back where they have used insurance from the blast disaster. And sooner or later, there's going to be no insurance is going to be available for them. So what kind of scenario do you see happening in the future with that topic, Don?
Well, Nico, you're right. The insurance thing is a problem, and I always try and look at it as an opportunity to do some good. If we can change the way insurance companies, insure properties in the face of climate change, that's going to wake people up to the problem. There's an actual real part of this in South Dakota in the insurance world with crop insurance. So the federal government has a crop insurance program that we taxpayers help subsidize to the tune of about 60% of farmer premiums for their crops, and they pay the other 40%. But when you're having weather events, more and more weather events that are decreasing yields, making it impossible year to year to have the same operation produce the same amount of food, but we're insuring that every year again and again at the same price, that's just telling the people that are doing the practice, that's reinforcing bad behavior. So there are levers there with the insurance world that we can use to modify behavior. Now, some folks might not like to hear that in the political world, but that is a tool we can use to change behavior, is insurance. Lawrence?
Well, I'm looking at crisis management in relative to Lenico's question and input, and I thank you for that, Lenico. This, unfortunately, humans often don't see something until it's a crisis. It's like they wait and wait, and it's not just in the national issues; in their personal lives. We have a habit of putting things off. It's kind of like sweeping the dirt under the rug until we trip on that bump, when the rug raises up, or something like that. So, I think that's why I was trying to get to earlier about, well, how do we maybe live different? What are some things that we could do to, to make it easy? Because even though mindfulness is a thing, I mean, my life is about mindfulness, but I recognize that people can't be conscious of everything all the time because we don't have the processing power for it. As much as we like to go romantic about our brains, it really is not up to the task of being, paying attention to everything. It's like, I remember being in the Boy Scouts, they used to say, be prepared. And my question was, prepared for what? You can't be prepared for everything. If you do, you're prepared for nothing because you'd be hauling around all kinds of stuff trying to be prepared for stuff. So how do you know what to prepare for? I think the brain has limitations like that. So now we have to figure kind of crutches for ourselves. It's like, well, how can we form the world so that we can do things kind of on automatic, but it's automatic, but it's not killing us, and it's, how do we make that transition? That's the kind of solutions I'm looking for, because I'm not really impressed that humans can make conscious decisions moment by moment for the greater good when the greater good is not even well defined. So I don't hold out a whole bunch of hope for that kind of approach. But maybe, maybe that's all we got. But I want to look for something else. I'd like to look for something else.
Well, we need
Before,
leadership too. I mean, you got to look to
yeah,
from the county level on up. We need people that are leading our governments, and that's the biggest lever we can pull is the government and the power of the federal government, the state government, the local government, and we need folks in those positions to do the people's bidding, which is keep our environment and our water clean. I think it's a
right,
basic ask. It's not a hard
right,
ask, but that's what we need,
right.
and it's not happening.
But those people come from us.
Yes.
All of those people, they're not magically where we come up with some money and then they suddenly appear. We have to we have to be raising those kind of people. We have to be supporting those people. We have to be those people. We can't just say, oh, those people up there, the magic federal government. I mean, sure, it sounds easy because we can point to those people, but I'm just thinking, where do those people come from? They come from us. They come out of these, often out of places like Roslyn, South Dakota. You know, they're our neighbors. You know, they're not some magical group that comes along the leadership. These are real people. I'm just thinking, like, what do each of us do if we're not going to be those people? How do we create an environment where those kind of people go into work for the people, i.e., government, as opposed to corporate interests? How do we support that? That said, we have about 5 minutes, and I'd like to talk about the imbalance of impact on environmental movement. We don't have probably enough time to talk about that, but can you just talk to us a little bit about the imbalance of the impact of a bad environmental decision?
Well, I mean, so I'll give you a good example. Here's an issue that I have still struggle with. I'm still conflicted with, and every day I flip flop on it, and that's nuclear power. And because I'm very concerned about climate change, if I push everything, water quality is more than my world, but climate change affects everything, and I've kind of got to be there. And whenever time I think about how to reduce emissions, nuclear comes up because it is a low carbon way of providing plentiful electricity, which we need. However, then there was a proposed one in Lake Wahi, I think, around the Missouri about 10 years ago. You have an incident and an accident. That is the half-life of whatever the radioactive material that will leach in the water would make that water undrinkable, unusable for the rest of the lifetime of the people who live around that. So that's a trade-off. You have to say to yourself, okay, I'm willing to take this risk in order to minimize this other risk. Again, Lawrence, I don't have a good answer. I'm on the fence on this issue every day. That's a problem. But we have hope, right? We have hope. And I think that's the thing we have to inject into these conversations. I have worked on these issues for a long time. The part of the Midnight Rambler, part of the reason I want to make something that was entertaining and like made people smile on occasion. I try to make it a comedy half the time, was because so much storytelling in this sphere is somber for a reason, because it is scary, because these bad things are happening. But if we can have hope about improvements and making things better, and we can make our successes known, like you and I talked about just recently, the Clean Water Act, Nixon actually cleaned up a lot of the bad things happening. It can happen. Let's talk more about the positive, that it can happen and we can affect these changes. And I think that's the way we're going to get there. I can get really depressed about all this real easy. It's easy to navigate right in there and be a doomer, but I refuse to do that, because I believe we can solve these problems, and I believe we can have a quality of life like
You
you talked
refused,
about.
but you got stuck.
Nope.
You got stuck. Say it again. You refused, and then
I refuse to be a doomer. I just refuse to be a doomer, and I'd rather be a hopeful person about the way this is all going. That's all.
Great, great. And I think we can all learn something from that. It's like, we can all participate. None of us can do everything, but all of us can do something. And if we all do that something, things happen. You know, if I were looking for a solution like energy and water, I'm gonna think hydrogen. You know, and because and I think about hydrogen, and people say, oh, well, it's not very efficient, the conversion. Electricity is storing and that kind of thing. But to me, if we have a water problem and an energy problem, and we have like, okay, like wind, we sometimes get more energy than we have the transmission lines for, and all of these other solar, the same thing, nighttime, daytime. It just seems like to me, it's like if you can throw all of that into hydrogen by electrolysis, you solve a water problem too, especially if it maybe not solve it, but you add something to the mix because that is pure water. When you,
Yeah.
when you run it through electrolysis, you're not going to get pure water than that. Nature does not provide pure water than that. You know, you actually have to add pollutants back in so you
Right.
get so that you get some minerals in it. So
And the argument
and
against
so
that
I
would be, I'm sorry, go ahead.
go. No, you go ahead.
Well, the argument someone would use against that is like, oh, well, that takes massive infrastructure, right? The same thing with EVs and the transition to EVs. It takes all this infrastructure, charging, all that stuff. We did this once already with gasoline.
Yeah.
We can do it again. We can do it again with hydrogen.
Yes, sir. And by the way, that's because we think large infrastructure.
Right.
We can do this different. Uh, Unfortunately, though, we'll have to do it different another time because we ran out of time. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and we hope you'll show up at the book fair. And you can continue this discussion at that time. Until that time, thank you for being with us, and we'll see you next week, same time, same station.
Thanks so
Bye.
much. Appreciate it.